You're here because you want to know the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy. Stick around, we're going to get right to it. My favorite movies are Lord of the Rings and Conan the Barbarian. They are also in two very different fantasy subgenres. One of them is in sword and sorcery. The other is in high fantasy. We're going to talk about not only what's the difference between those two genres, but also the authors behind them. And if you stick around long enough, you'll find out who inspired the father of sword and sorcery. Conan the Barbarian is the prototypical sword and sorcery movie and books. If you go back to Robert E. Howard from the 1920s and 30s, he is the author that first wrote about Conan. He created him. And then the movie that was created in the 70s subsequently was based on that character. Lord of the Rings is on the other side of the spectrum. It's high fantasy. It's written by Tolkien. I watched that movie in the theater when it first came out, and it was just awesome. I loved it. I can't believe how amazing it was to see that on the screen for the first time, presented to me, and I was like, this is incredible. But I love both of those movies and those two different stories for two very different reasons. Let's break down the differences between sword and sorcery and high fantasy. First, character versus the world. In the sword and sorcery tales like Conan, the character drives the entire story. It's all about their development, who they are as a person, the trials they experience along the way. And it's often dark, it's often gritty, they're often up against incredible odds. And the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy is that the character is primarily important. In high fantasy, it's more about the world. It's about how the entire story, the entire realm is impacted by the actions of the character. But it's the exact opposite in sword and sorcery. Conan is all about Conan. If you read the books, if you watch the movie, the only person that Conan gives a shit about is Conan, as well as the women that he loves and he's trying to, hook up with. But the point is, it's all about Conan. It's not so much about Samaria and the developments of the political factions within Samaria or the Hyborian kingdoms. It's just all about Conan. That's one thing I love about it. Now, Lord of the Rings is the opposite. It's about what's happening in Middle-earth, what's happening between the different kingdoms, and what's happening in the different political structures. And it's nuanced. And it's intricate. Of course, the Fellowship plays a huge role in how that unfolds, but it's not just about the Fellowship, it's about the whole spectrum of Middle-earth. The tone and the atmosphere of these two different subgenres are very different. Sword and sorcery is dark, it's gritty, it's violent, it's brutal, it's amoral. High fantasy is the exact opposite. It's a clear structure between good and evil. You've got the good guys on one side, you've got the bad guys on the other side. When I was younger, I loved Lord of the Rings for that reason. It was just a clear struggle of good versus evil. As I've gotten older, I've come to love sword and sorcery a whole lot more because there's ambiguity in it. For those of you that don't know, Robert E. Howard was the father of sword and sorcery. He was the author in the 20s and 30s who wrote Conan and also wrote other stories like Cull and Solomon Kane. However, Conan is the hero that's most typically associated with Robert E. Howard, but who inspired Robert E. Howard? You've got a guy named Harold Lamb, who is both a historian, an author, and a fiction writer from the early 1900s who wrote historical adventure fiction. Now, I just started reading Harold Lamb about a year ago, and it is almost word for word an echo of Robert E. Howard. He was probably Robert E. Howard's favorite author because if you look at the prose and the story of Harold Lamb, it is almost the same in terms of how it's laid out and the pacing as the Conan stories. And they're exciting, they're a great read, and with the exception of magic, they're almost the same type of story. You've got heroes, it's a dark, gritty world, especially the stories that Lamb wrote about the Crusades. It's a vicious environment where there's good and bad on both sides. The moral characteristics are very similar to the Conan stories. If you want to check out some of Lamb's work, I've dropped a link in the description below. I really recommend it, especially if you're interested in not only sword and sorcery, but where sword and sorcery came from. All right, let's talk about magic. Within sword and sorcery and high fantasy, magic is definitely present, but it plays a very different role. In sword and sorcery, magic is often on the periphery. Conan, in his world, there are mysterious forces he does not understand. And those things often can be displayed as magic or sorcerous elements, but it's never clear exactly what force they're serving. In high fantasy, it's the exact opposite. Magic is very clear in terms of what side it's on. You've got Gandalf, you've got Saruman, you've got Sauron. All of these characters clearly on a specific side, and they stand for something. And they represent forces of good and evil. And the magic is much more pronounced. Wizards have school, and there's organization, and there's training. In sword and sorcery, it's totally different. Magic is just something that's out there. It exists, and it almost represents that force of nature that is unknown in our world. Lastly, let's talk about the world. In sword and sorcery tales, it is the exact opposite of high fantasy. The world is not as important in the Conan stories as in high fantasy. And the reason for that is those two types of stories are trying to do two different things. If you look at the origins of the two literary forms of sword and sorcery writing and high fantasy writing with Tolkien, It comes from the adventure fiction in the 19-teens, the 1920s, the 1930s, and the way it was published was in digests, monthly digests that would release short chunks or excerpts of stories, and you would consume them much the way you do today with short form media on YouTube or on Netflix. Tolkien wrote long novels that were designed for a whole different purpose, and thus a sword and sorcery tale might only be 20 or 30 pages long, and it's designed as a quick, fast-paced adventure story that's there to hook your attention and then keep you coming back for the next one, much the way the YouTube algorithm works. So what do I prefer? Well, at this point in my life, I lean towards sword and sorcery. I like the amoral nature of the stories, and I think the character-driven plots are exciting. Plus, it's a little bit shorter, and as I've gotten older, my attention span has gotten a little bit shorter as well. When I was younger, I really liked Lord of the Rings, and I still love Lord of the Rings, but I don't have the time to sit down and read the book every single year like I used to. But I want to know what you guys like. I want to know what you prefer. Are you interested in sword and sorcery? Do you like high fantasy? Are there some stories that you really want to share that you enjoy? Drop them in the comments below. Also, if you have questions, please let me know. I love talking about this stuff. It's been a passion of mine for over 25 years, and let me know how I can help you. If you're new to the channel, my name is Adam Scott. I appreciate you being here. I am the owner and founder of RPG Club. We run professional role-playing games across the country. Currently, we run over 100 active campaigns, and we've taught over 5,000 people how to play. This YouTube channel represents a new stage in my journey as a lover of fantasy, of sword and sorcery, of building community and bringing people together. If you're interested in being along for the ride or participating in that, if you would consider subscribing, I would really appreciate it. And if you have enjoyed this content at all, it always helps to drop a like on the video. If you want to learn more, take a look at some of the videos recommended above, and I'm excited to see you the next time around.